Everyone left the office, except them. And suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. The office had emptied out hours ago. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound breaking the silence, mingling with the faint click of my keyboard as I finished one last report. I leaned back in my chair, stretching my arms above my head, and felt the tension of the day slowly loosen from my shoulders. The fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the empty cubicles, giving everything a slightly surreal, almost intimate quality. The usual chatter, ringing phones, and footsteps were gone, replaced by the subtle creaks of the office building settling into night. I was lost in the quiet, almost meditative in the stillness, when I caught it, a faint sound of movement behind me. Not loud enough to be obvious, but there. A soft shuffle of shoes on the carpet. I glanced up instinctively and felt a small jolt in my chest. The office was supposed to be empty. Yet, at the far end of the room, two figures lingered just out of focus, framed by the dim overhead lights. The first thing I noticed was the way they moved. Not hurried, not accidental. It was deliberate, measured, almost like they were testing the silence before stepping fully into it. There was something magnetic about the way they walked. The sway of their hips, the soft click of heels, the faint brush of a sleeve against the air. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with an unfamiliar, subtle anticipation I couldn't quite name. Then came the scent, subtle, lingering, warm. A floral perfume that hinted at something soft and inviting, mingling with the faint aroma of brewed coffee still lingering from earlier in the day. It wrapped around me like a whisper, and I realized my chest felt tighter, my awareness sharper. The office, empty and quiet a moment ago, suddenly seemed smaller, more intimate. I straightened in my chair, trying to focus on the remaining documents on my screen, but the movement at the corner of my vision kept pulling me back. The figures paused for a moment, just long enough that I could see them clearly now. Both women, confident in posture yet graceful, moved with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in their own skin. Their expressions were calm, composed, but there was a spark in their eyes, a hint of curiosity, amusement, perhaps even something deeper, that I could feel across the room. For a brief moment, I realized I was not alone. Not just in the physical sense, but emotionally, too. A current of tension, subtle and unspoken, threaded itself through the air between us. I felt it in my chest, in the warmth pooling in my stomach, in the sudden sharpness of my senses. The rustle of paper, the soft squeak of my chair, the faint whir of the AC. Everything became amplified, charged with possibility. And then, without warning, one of them brushed past a desk near mine, just close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her body. It was a fleeting touch, almost accidental, but it left me aware in a way I hadn't been all day. My hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to focus or simply watch, as the quiet, lingering presence of these two women filled the office and my thoughts. By the time I realized it, the ordinary night in the office had already transformed. What began as a mundane late work session had shifted into something unspoken, charged, and unforgettable. The tension was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a quiet promise of what was about to unfold. The office felt different now. What had been a quiet, empty space in Keynote 1 had grown denser, charged with a subtle energy I couldn't name. I was halfway through organizing my desk when I became aware of movement, soft, deliberate footsteps across the carpet. Not the hurried shuffle of someone rushing out, but a calm, measured approach that seemed to resonate in the stillness around me. I glanced up, and for a moment my pulse caught in my throat. There they were, two women, poised, confident, moving toward me with an ease that made the world shrink around us. They didn't speak at first. Their presence alone filled the space, a warm, quiet gravity that made me suddenly conscious of every detail. The sway of their hips, the subtle curve of their shoulders, the soft fabric of their clothes brushing against their skin as they walked. I noticed the way one of them paused near a bookshelf, just enough to glance at me over her shoulder. Her eyes met mine for a heartbeat longer than polite, and there was something in that look, curiosity, amusement, maybe even a hint of something unspoken, that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't flirtation in the obvious sense, but the subtle pull of someone confident, aware, and quietly daring. The second woman mirrored her movement, stopping near my desk as though the space itself belonged to her. The timing of their steps, their calm confidence, it all felt choreographed, intentional, though I knew it couldn't be. Then came the faintest brush of air as one of them passed close to me. It carried the warm, floral scent of her perfume, subtle but distinct, threading through the bland, recycled air of the office. It was disarming, a sensory detail I hadn't expected but immediately registered. My heart skipped a beat, though I told myself it was just surprise. Still, my chest felt tight. My hands paused mid-motion over the papers on my desk, aware that the office, so ordinary just minutes ago, had transformed into something charged, intimate, and unpredictable. Their movements were deliberate but unhurried. Nothing screamed confrontation or overt desire. Instead, there was a quiet magnetism in the way they approached. Their eyes lingered, but never too long. Their smiles were small, controlled, yet there was warmth there, teasing and gentle, making me aware of the slow burn of connection already forming. Even the sound of their steps, the soft click of heels, the whisper of skirts against legs, felt amplified in the empty room, a rhythm that somehow mirrored the quickening of my own heartbeat. For a moment, I considered retreating to the safety of my chair, pretending to focus on my work. But I couldn't. Something in the way they moved, the way their presence seemed to fill the space, held me in place. I was conscious of every subtle brush of air, every tiny movement, every glance that lingered just long enough to make me aware of the invisible tension threading between us. By the time they reached the corner of the office, I realized the ordinary night had become extraordinary. Their approach wasn't aggressive, it wasn't overt. It was a slow, deliberate weaving of presence, curiosity, and quiet power. And in that charged silence, I understood something undeniable. The night ahead would be far from ordinary, and the two women closing in on me were the spark igniting it. By the time they reached the far corner of the office, the space felt impossibly small, though in reality, it was the same quiet, familiar area I had walked past countless times. Now, every detail seemed sharper, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the subtle creak of the floor beneath their heels, even the faint rustle of papers on my desk. It wasn't just my attention that had shifted, the atmosphere itself had thickened, charged with the quiet electricity of anticipation. They moved with a grace that made hesitation impossible. One of the women leaned slightly against a tall filing cabinet, resting an arm casually yet deliberately, while the other stood just a step away from my desk, as if guiding me without words. I realized slowly, with a jolt I couldn't ignore, that I was being cornered, but not aggressively. There was no threat here, only the magnetic pull of presence, deliberate and intimate. My heartbeat picked up, a rhythm echoing the quiet tension threading between us. Conversation began almost accidentally, small talk at first, meant to fill the silence. Comments about the day, passing jokes about a client, observations about the office lights being too harsh. But there was an unspoken undertone in every word, a subtle rhythm that drew my attention far more than the content. When one of them laughed softly at something I said, it wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration that seemed to pass straight through me, warming my chest. Their eyes held mine for a beat longer than necessary, and I caught myself searching for meaning in the way their smiles curved, the way their fingers brushed against a notebook or the edge of the desk. Then there was the closeness. Not forced, not intentionally provocative, but close enough that I felt warmth radiating from their bodies, subtle shifts of movement that made the air feel almost alive. One of them leaned slightly forward to examine a document I had pulled up on my screen, her hair brushing just enough against my arm to send a shiver up my spine. The other rested a hand near mine, fingers lingering on the edge of the desk. Almost accidental, I told myself, but my awareness of every touch heightened. I was acutely conscious of the way their presence bent the room, how even small gestures could make me feel both grounded and unsteady at the same time. I realized I was no longer just observing. I was participating in the unspoken dance of attention and restraint. Every glance, every subtle gesture carried weight, and I felt it pressing gently against the confines of the empty office. The corner, once just a functional space, had become intimate, almost a sanctuary where unspoken understanding thrived. I noticed the warmth of their proximity, the faint perfume blending with the neutral office air, the way their voices dropped slightly when they leaned closer, as if the empty space demanded softness. By the time the conversation lulled into a quiet pause, the emotional gravity of the moment had fully settled in. I was aware of my chest tightening, of the subtle acceleration of my pulse, of the thrill of being seen and cornered in this way. The office was no longer just a workplace. It was a threshold into something unfamiliar, yet tantalizingly close. And I understood, with a quiet certainty, that this corner wasn't just a spot in the room. It was where the story between us had quietly begun. The corner of the office felt alive in a way I hadn't anticipated. The earlier tension had settled into something softer, more deliberate, a quiet intimacy that wasn't rushed or forced. Conversation had slowed, leaving small pauses that felt heavier than words, charged with meaning I wasn't entirely prepared to parse. We were talking, yes, about the day, the projects, minor frustrations with clients, but every word seemed layered, carrying undercurrents of something more personal, something unspoken. I noticed it in the way they listened, fully present, leaning slightly forward when I spoke. The warmth of their attention was a physical thing, subtle, comforting, almost like a blanket wrapping around me without me realizing it. One of them brushed a strand of hair behind her ear while laughing softly at an offhand joke I made, and the movement, small as it was, sent a strange flutter through my chest. The other rested her hand casually near mine on the edge of the desk, fingers just grazing the back of my hand. I felt the heat where we touched, a silent, electrifying acknowledgement that lingered longer than propriety might allow. There was an honesty in their presence that caught me off guard. They weren't trying to impress or manipulate. They simply existed in this space, aware of me, aware of the tension, yet patient, allowing it to breathe. I found myself sharing little pieces of my own life, hesitations I usually kept to myself. A story about a weekend hike, a fleeting worry about an upcoming project, even a quiet reflection on how empty the office had felt that evening. They listened, genuinely interested, their smiles soft, encouraging, never intrusive. The emotional weight of being heard, truly heard, made my chest ache in the best way. The pauses between our words grew longer, and in those silences, the tension thickened. One of them glanced at me and held my gaze for a heartbeat too long. The subtle curve of her smile, the slight tilt of her head, the warmth of her eyes, it spoke volumes without a single word. My pulse raced in response, my mind acutely aware of the delicate dance unfolding. It wasn't desperation or even obvious attraction. It was a quiet recognition, a silent confession of mutual curiosity and interest. Physical closeness was minimal but deliberate. The brush of shoulders as we leaned over a document, the accidental graze of a hand as she shifted, the soft warmth radiating from their presence. It was all deeply intimate, without crossing boundaries. Each small contact left a ripple in my awareness, grounding me in the moment while simultaneously pulling me towards something I couldn't yet name. By the time the conversation wound down into another reflective pause, I realized that the corner of the office was no longer just a neutral space. It had become a quiet stage for subtle confessions, shared vulnerability, and unspoken desire. My chest felt full, my mind alert, and my heart quietly thrilled by the realization that these two women, so composed, so confident, so quietly powerful, had opened a door into something profoundly human and utterly irresistible. In the silence that followed, I understood it clearly. The night had shifted. Something had begun, and there was no turning back. The quiet intimacy of the office had settled into something almost tangible, like a current running just beneath the surface of our interaction. Each glance, each movement, seemed to carry weight, and I became acutely aware of how small gestures could convey more than words ever could. The conversation had slowed to an easy rhythm, punctuated by soft laughter and thoughtful pauses, but it was the subtle physical proximity that made my chest tighten with anticipation. At one point, one of the women reached out to point at a document I was reviewing. Her fingers hovered near mine, brushing the edge of my hand for the briefest moment. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, or at least I told myself it was, but it left a lingering warmth that I couldn't ignore. My fingers tingled where they had touched, and my mind involuntarily focused on the subtle details of her movement. The curve of her wrist, the gentle way her hand lingered in the air, the soft sigh as she leaned closer to read the screen. The office, quiet and empty, suddenly felt alive with tension, charged by the electricity of proximity. The other woman moved as well, shifting slightly to glance over my shoulder at the same screen. Her arm brushed against mine, a delicate touch that made me hyper-aware of the space between us. I caught the faint scent of her perfume, warm and floral, drifting across the gap, wrapping around me in a way that was at once comforting and intoxicating. I found myself leaning back slightly in my chair, trying to compose myself, yet unable to resist the pull of their presence. Their smiles were small, subtle, and deliberate. One raised an eyebrow at something I said, and the corner of her lips quirked into an expression that felt both teasing and inviting. The other let her gaze linger a moment longer than necessary, soft eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. It was the kind of attention that spoke volumes without a single word. Interest, curiosity, and a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken tension building between us. Even in silence, the energy between us was undeniable. The faint brush of shoulders, the way their bodies shifted in the confined space, the subtle warmth radiating from their presence, it all amplified the intimacy of the moment. I was aware of every detail, from the slight catch in my breath when their hands neared mine to the rapid thump of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The office, once merely a place of work, had become a stage for this slow, deliberate dance of closeness and restraint. Time seemed to stretch, each second laden with meaning. I realized that the gentle touches, the lingering glances, and the quiet shared laughter were weaving a connection that was both exciting and comforting. There was no rush, no need to force anything, just the slow, deliberate awareness of each other's presence and the subtle thrill of what might be unfolding. By the end of that quiet stretch, I understood something profoundly simple. The tension wasn't just about proximity or attraction. It was about presence, attention, and shared vulnerability. And as I glanced up at them, feeling the warmth of their subtle touches and the intensity of their eyes, I knew that this gentle tension was the bridge to something far deeper, something I couldn't yet name, but was undeniably drawn toward. The office had become a world entirely its own, a small universe carved out of fluorescent lights, the faint hum of the AC, and the soft rustle of papers. In that corner, the atmosphere felt electric, charged with a current I could feel in my chest, my pulse quickening with every subtle movement around me. The quiet laughter that punctuated our conversation seemed almost louder than it should have, resonating like a shared secret between the three of us. It was the pauses that carried the most weight. Moments of silence stretched just long enough that my awareness of them became overwhelming. One of the women tilted her head, her gaze lingering on me as if reading something I hadn't spoken aloud. The intensity of her eyes made my chest tighten, a mix of anticipation, nervousness, and something tender I couldn't yet name. The other leaned forward slightly over the edge of the desk, her hand resting near mine for the briefest instant, the warmth of her touch radiating through my skin. It wasn't bold or aggressive. It was deliberate, intimate, and infinitely more impactful for its subtlety. The tension had grown, layered, and multifaceted. It wasn't just the nearness of their bodies. It was the way they existed in the space with me. Their voices softened, modulated almost unconsciously to match the quiet of the room. Every laugh was measured, every glance loaded with unspoken meaning. When one of them touched my arm lightly as she laughed at something I said, the sensation was electric, sending a shiver through me I could not contain. And when the other offered a fleeting smile that lingered just a second too long, I felt an ache of longing I couldn't articulate. The subtle intimacy of these touches, the brush of a shoulder, the warmth of a hand near mine, the way they leaned closer under the pretense of reading a document, made time feel both slow and accelerated at once. I was acutely aware of every sound, the soft click of heels, the rustle of their hair as it fell across their shoulders, even the faint echo of my own breathing in the quiet room. Each detail imprinted itself on me, a mosaic of sensory impressions that made the moment feel larger, heavier, and profoundly personal. And yet, despite the intensity, everything remained measured, respectful. There was no rush, no pressure, only the slow build of connection, the mutual acknowledgement of an unspoken bond forming. I caught myself noticing the subtle contrasts between them, one confident, playful, teasing in her glances, the other quietly intense, grounding, her presence comforting yet tantalizing. Together, they created a tension that was both thrilling and comforting, a dynamic I had never experienced before. By the time the conversation lulled into another silence, I realized the truth. The emotional peak had arrived. It wasn't marked by grand gestures or declarations. It was in the small, deliberate touches, the lingering eye contact, the shared laughter, and the quiet awareness of each other's presence. My heart raced, my senses heightened, and yet a strange calmness settled over me. In that charged, intimate corner of the office, I understood something essential. I was exactly where I needed to be, caught in the delicate, intoxicating space between desire and restraint, curiosity and connection, anticipation and quiet fulfillment. The moment lingered, heavy with the unspoken, before it began to soften. The tension that had filled the office all evening slowly eased, leaving behind a quiet warmth that wrapped around us like a soft blanket. Their laughter, gentle and teasing, still echoed in my ears, carrying a promise of connection that didn't need words. The corner that had felt so charged now seemed comforting, almost protective, a quiet space where we could exist together without the pressures of the outside world. As we began to straighten papers and gather our things, the air between us remained delicate but lighter. The glances we exchanged were soft, careful, acknowledging everything that had passed without needing to articulate it. One of them brushed past my shoulder as she moved toward the exit, the warmth of her body leaving a lingering sensation I carried long after she had stepped away. The other lingered a moment longer by my desk, her eyes catching mine with a gentle intensity that made my chest tighten in the most familiar, thrilling way. We walked toward the door together, not as colleagues leaving the office, but as three people who had crossed a threshold, however subtly, into something different. Their steps were measured, in rhythm with one another, creating a quiet harmony that contrasted sharply with the empty office we had left behind. The fluorescent lights overhead cast long shadows, softening our forms and lending the moment an almost cinematic quality. I realized how deeply I had been attuned to every gesture, every glance, every small brush of warmth all evening. And now, as we reached the exit, there was a sense of gentle closure, a shared understanding that this was only the beginning, not an ending. Later, as I left the office and walked to my car, my phone buzzed with messages that were playful, affectionate, and subtly suggestive without being forward. A small emoji here, a teasing comment there, nothing overt, but enough to make my pulse quicken and my lips curve into an involuntary smile. It was a continuation of what had begun in that quiet corner, a reminder that the connection we had sparked wasn't confined to the office space. It was real, tangible, and mutual. Driving home, I found myself reflecting on the evening with a sense of quiet awe. The women had been composed, confident, and gracefully aware of the tension they had created, yet they had handled it with warmth and subtlety. I marveled at how something as simple as a lingering look, a gentle touch, a shared laugh could carry so much emotional weight. The office had been the catalyst, but the true connection, the slow, careful, beautiful unfolding of understanding and attraction, was something entirely more human, more profound. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt a sense of calm and anticipation intertwined. There was no rush, no expectation, only the quiet knowledge that something rare and meaningful had begun. The night had shifted from ordinary to unforgettable, from mundane to intimate, all in the space of a few stolen hours. And as I closed the door behind me, I smiled to myself, knowing that the memory of their warmth, their presence, and the delicate, unspoken bond we had shared would linger long after the office lights went out. The story had reached its natural, emotionally satisfying conclusion, not with a dramatic revelation, but with the quiet understanding that connections, when handled with patience, respect, and care, could be just as thrilling, just as consuming, and infinitely more enduring than anything forced or rushed.